I want to make a video, hopefully a quick video on this Doug Cifu interview. I know it's going around the internet a lot, and I just kind of wanted to make a video on questions that I have logically of what he speaks here. I am not a market wizard of the plumbing, but I think what he says here is a little bit odd to me, speaking from a stance of logic. Now, it's obvious in this interview that the narrator and host is on his side, and they say that retail has it as good as ever. May or may not be true. It is apparent that retail pays for the spread, which is where the market makers are making their money. Obviously, he is going to defend his stance that allows him to live the life of luxury that he probably lives. So I think that this is important to keep in the back of our minds as we watch these interviews, the narratives that they're going to try to create. Of course, most people know that. But I want to listen to what he says about infinite liquidity, which I'm not necessarily convinced is a good thing for the market.
Very upfront and very transparent about providing that level of data. So what that means is in the 8,000 names, to the extent there's not liquidity on a lit exchange, fundamentally the wholesalers are providing infinite liquidity at the NBBO or the inside price. So if we get an order for 1,000 shares in Reg NMS stock that no one's ever heard of, and there's 200 shares on NASDAQ in New York, we fill out 1,000 shares at that inside price.
So he says a few things here. He says a lot in that 10 seconds to me. One, he says that on the market, if there's not liquidity, that they essentially give wholesalers infinite liquidity. I think what I'm struggling to understand is, wouldn't liquidity kind of affect supply and demand and price? So if there wasn't something available, shouldn't that be more expensive to purchase? So by them providing liquidity, aren't they in turn controlling the price, share price, essentially, to some extent, because they're providing this price of the NBBO, the National Bid Best Offer price, before they know if there is liquidity in that or not. So they're creating liquidity. That makes sense. But infinite liquidity, I feel like, is confusing verbiage. And I feel like in a world of supply and demand, that's not what you should have. And now I want to go over what he says next about having 200 shares available and they want it filled at 1,000, that they provide that liquidity as well.
In the 8,000 names, to the extent there's not liquidity on a lit exchange, fundamentally the wholesalers are providing infinite liquidity at the NBBO or the inside price. So if we get an order for 1,000 shares in Reg NMS stock that no one's ever heard of, and there's 200 shares on NASDAQ in New York, we fill out 1,000 shares at that inside price. That's meaningful liquidity.
So I guess what he's saying is they go out and find the other 800 shares on other exchanges. So like I said, I don't understand the plumbing of the market well enough to really have an argument there, but from a logical standpoint, to me, it seems like that would be them selling 800 shares of stock that they don't own yet. So they're providing that liquidity, but it's in a sense, it's naked liquidity through a naked sell of a share, right? Not necessarily that it's sold short, but where is the 800 shares coming from? Are they coming from a different exchange, or are they in fact just naked shares that were purchased? So that's kind of the confusion I have on the liquidity process. And I don't like the verbiage of infinite liquidity. I wish maybe somebody comes out with a video that understands market plumbing, or a regulator that could speak to whether or not it's a good thing that the market has infinite liquidity. Because it seems like if I had a Snickers bar on a shelf and someone came in to purchase this Snickers bar, and as soon as it was the last one in the box, and as soon as I grabbed it, another one magically reappeared, that the price of that would stay the same or go down, because there's an infinite amount of them. There is no supply and demand. So as long as the line was 100 people deep, they could essentially charge whatever they wanted for that Snickers bar, creating demand that fits the supply. But that doesn't make sense to me, because there isn't an infinite supply of anything in the world. There should only be a finite supply of stock. That's what gives it its value. So I'm a little bit concerned with infinite liquidity inside the market. The other thing I want to touch on is this internalization. So if an order is filled internally for $20 and they shelf it or hold it, and the end of the day the stock goes down, I would assume that they line these orders up with the best price improvement that they find, but then they kind of get to keep the meat. So the other thing that's kind of confusing me is internalization, and I tried to read a little bit on this, but there just isn't enough clarity on what exactly internalization is or why it's needed. I guess because the market moves so fast that we need this internalization to provide infinite liquidity. But again, is infinite liquidity a good thing? So I think that's the main question that I have, is that this infinite liquidity, is that necessarily good for retail? And that's what these conversations need to be based around. We don't have a question that the market's good for payment for order flow, for market makers, for wholesalers. Yeah, these brokerages are printing money still. So I think that that's his stance, is he's defending market makers and wholesalers when Gary Gensler is on the side of retail. So they're trying to improve the market for retail. Liquidity should never be retail's true problem. Retail is known on more of a buy and hold standard. So I don't think that liquidity and being able to get out of something quickly is necessarily their retail's problem as much as it is a broker's problem. So you can read on the SEC site that about internalization, and this is kind of where I tried to figure out why exactly we need to internalize orders. Again, it's pretty vague. You can read it here if you want to go over it. Just Google internalization, market maker orders, SEC, and it should be the first document that comes up. But basically, the main thing I took from this is your broker may decide to send your order to another division of broker's firm to be filled out of the firm's own inventory. This is called internalization. So if they essentially hold a stock, then they can sell you it. And then I want to go over this Gamestop report just very quickly. I highlighted some notes. I believe it starts on page 26-ish. Page 27. So this is a figure of short interest on GameStop throughout the years. This blue line is comparative to common stocks. So you can see the short interest on GameStop has stayed relatively high throughout the years. I just thought that was very interesting, and how this got covered so quickly when orders were being filled internally, which is what I'm going to touch on. So, and then I want to go over this just briefly. In a naked short sale, the seller does not borrow or arrange to borrow the securities in time to make delivery to the buyer within the standard 2-day settlement period. As a result, the seller fails to deliver securities to the buyer when delivery is due. Because direct measures of naked short selling do not exist, fails to deliver can be used to learn about naked short selling. Naked short selling can have a negative effect on the market. For example, fraudsters may be able to naked short sell as a tool to manipulate the market, which is illegal. In this regard, the Commission in 2008 adopted Rule 10b-21, a naked short selling anti-fraud rule. So I think this goes back to what he's talking about when he speaks about selling 1,000 shares when there's only 200 available. I'd love to know how that's not naked short selling, how that's not a negative effect on the market, because someone shouldn't get the same price for 1,000 shares of something when there's only 200 available. That should make the price go up. So if they're internalizing those prices, I feel like that we're not getting the true price for the market, what the market should demand, which in an auction scenario would be a true supply and demand market. The internalization of orders surely is affecting price so that they can have liquidity. And if we go down here, I'm going to read about what I thought the most important thing about this video would be. And this is kind of the GME stock, and this is the internalization of orders. So the executed exchange orders for January 21 were internalized approximately 80%. This is on the big run of GME, as opposed to executed on dark pools or alternative trading services. So the market for internalization of GME was highly concentrated, with 88% of it internalized dollar volume in January, executed by just 3 wholesalers. So Citadel, nearly 50% of the internalized dollar volume, and it rose to as high as 55% of the daily internalized dollar volume twice. Virtu, Doug Cifu, who you just saw, accounted for approximately 26% internalized volume during January. And then it goes on to say, kind of, while the percentage of GME trading internalized declined during the last week of January, the absolute volumes executed by internalizing firms during those days of the most intense trading period actually increased a magnitude larger than what had previously been typical for these firms. So, for example, Citadel internalized an average of just 37 million GME per day, December 2020. So the following month, so a month later, there were 37 million a day. That's how much they internalized. So a month later, Citadel internalized nearly $4.2 billion of GME. Granted, the stock price went up, so the dollar amount's going to change, but that is a huge, huge gap. So they're internalizing $4.2 billion worth of orders, and Virtue internalized an average of $23.4 million a day in January, or in December, and the next month they did $2.2 billion on January 26th. So this, in a sense, is them discussing that infinite liquidity. So on January 29th, Citadel internalized approximately another $2.2 billion of GME stock, while Virtue internalized $1.4 billion. And I can't tell you what this means exactly, but these numbers are gigantic. These are huge numbers of internalization on the orders. So we have to expect that this had a huge impact on the price. So none of this was hitting a lit exchange for those prices. They were sitting here filling these orders to provide liquidity, and in turn, the buying had to stop. So I think this is actually a good argument to make that they needed the buying to stop because they were probably out of being able to provide liquidity for the market on GME. Just my opinion, but that would make sense to me. Like, all of this being internalized, there has to be something there. This is the GameStop report that the SEC released. I'm sure this has been covered in great detail by people much smarter than me, but this internalization stuff is just very interesting to me. So I don't know if this video was informative. It's more of just a theory and questions I have, and I hope that somebody can either leave a comment on what exactly internalization of orders are, or maybe there'll be a video come up on why we need it for liquidity, especially infinite liquidity, and why infinite liquidity is a good thing.